When my wife first encountered bats, you have to understand first that she's from the Bronx, was a city girl, and had never ever been on a farm, let alone lived on one. And her first reaction was a screech.
My very, very, very first impression of bats was with Bela Lugosi. It was not here on the farm, and so that sort of sets you up for a different kind of reaction. But having been around them and learning more about them, that reaction has changed, obviously.
Bats historically have been one of the most maligned and misunderstood group of organisms on Earth. But thanks to recent conservation and education efforts by state and federal agencies, as well as private organizations like the Nature Conservancy and Bat Conservation International, we've seen a real sea change in the public perception of bats. And this has been very invigorating for wildlife biologists to see. And we have a better understanding throughout the public of the important role that bats play in the environment.
All the bats we have in New York State, nine species, feed on flying insects primarily, insects of a variety of different species. When winter comes, if you look around you now, we have snow on the ground and there are no insects available to them. So they have to compensate for this lack of a food source in one of two ways. They can migrate south to where insects are more available, or they can accumulate fat supplies in the fall when insects are abundant, go into places that are, in terms of temperature and humidity, most appropriate for them, and just plain tough it out until spring. Yeah, I don't have any bad That's a message. Bats have the ability to control their metabolism, their respiratory rate, their heart rate, everything drops down to all intents and purposes, they appear to be dead. By doing so, they can conserve their energy and spread it out over the length of period of time when insects are not available to them. Over the course of the winter, they periodically wake up without any stimulus from the outside at all. And this waking process is a very energy expensive thing. 10, 15, 20 days of energy supplies are used in every arousal. They have that built in to their system. Okay, they can deal with that if they have to get up several times over the course of the winter. However, if people go in and disturb the bats, they wake up when they might not necessarily wanted to wake up on their own, and it causes them to burn up more energy than they would otherwise. Caves and mines in this portion of the country are only used by bats in the wintertime. Because the caves, the farther down you get, they semi-reflect the average annual temperature of the region. Although this is great for hibernating, it's far too cold for the bats to raise their young in the summertime. So our bats leave the caves and mines, go into a variety of different roosts, sometimes buildings, sometimes underneath the bark of trees or in dead trees, that kind of thing, and raise their young there because the temperatures are warmer and the young can use the energy that they're getting from their mothers to grow and get ready for the upcoming winter, and as opposed to using that energy trying to keep warm.
Beginning in May of the year, the bats are coming out of hibernation. They're leaving their hibernacle where they spent the winter, months roosting, and they begin to look for summer roosts. These can be natural roosts, or they could be anthropogenic or man-made roosts, meaning bridges, some mines, but most likely it's going to be, for the big brown, little brown bat, it's going to be buildings. And at that time, the males tend to be solitary or in very small groups, and the females form what we call maternity or nursery colonies, which are fairly large colonies of bats, ranging from like a handful, like 20, up to 600 or more bats in a single area. The females look for very specific microclimate. They're looking for rather warm attic space, for instance, upwards of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, so that when the young pups are born, they're not exposed to cold weather, which, just like any newborn, they need to have warmth. Bats generally have only one pup a year. Some species have two, so their reproductive rate is very low. They tend to live for a long time, but these maternity roosts become very important in terms of conservation because they are vulnerable. They are in places where people generally don't want them, and we have to really find ways to strike a balance between the needs of people and the needs of bats. Although we've done really good education efforts and tried to make sure that everybody understands the threat associated with bats is very minimal, there's still people out there that have a general fear. So we get a lot of requests for assistance, just asking, what should I do? I've seen a bat. Should I be fearful? And that kind of thing. We also get requests specific when bats are in buildings, in people's homes. That kind of smell associated with large concentrations of bats is very strong and pungent. And when people have bats in their attic, they generally know it, and they want some help in trying to alleviate that problem. In terms of noise, bats, when they're, again, in large concentrations, tend to scratch along the walls and when they're in the attics. And they also do a little bit of chattering amongst themselves, and so people hear that and have concerns. So that's the second group of kind of damage or conflicts that bats cause. And the third, and the one that people ask a lot of questions about as well, is the zoonotic diseases.
Rabies historically has been a very threatening and frightening disease to humans. The most frightening aspect, of course, is that rabies infection in humans and other animals, once the human or animal actually becomes with the disease, is virtually invariably fatal and therefore strikes a lot of fear in most people. Bat rabies is extremely widespread in North America geographically. It's been identified in all of the 39 indigenous North American bat species that have been adequately examined. Prevalence of rabies infection in normal behaving bats collected in colonies or roosts where we would expect to find the bats is generally reported to be a fraction of 1%. Amongst bats that are encountered by people, either flying around inside their buildings, found on the ground outdoors, picked up by a cat or another pet, or the occasional bat that actually bites a person. Amongst those animals, somewhere between 3 and 5% are generally reported to be infected with the disease. Bats, like other mammals, get sick with rabies and then die of the disease after a period of somewhere around a week to 10 days of illness at the longest. And they are capable of transmitting the disease during that period or up to a couple days before we begin to recognize the signs of the disease.
The symptoms of rabies in people is very similar to that in animals. There's often weeks to months between the time of the exposure and when illness and death eventually develop. In some cases, they've been documented in humans to be up to years that the incubation period extends.
Recent examination of cases in the United States in the last decade indicate that people are developing bat rabies from either inapparent bat bites or bat bites that were not reported or investigated. In the past decade, there have been 22 human rabies deaths in this country, and 20 of those were due to bat rabies. Both national and state rabies guidelines for handling bat exposures are similar to the guidelines for other animal exposures in that if someone knows they have been bitten by a bat or having some kind of contact with nervous tissue or saliva that gets into an open wound or a mucous membrane or a scratch, that they need to consider rabies treatment. The national and state guidelines are different for bat exposures in that the recognition of the human cases in this decade has led to a recommendation for treatment when there's a reasonable probability that one of these types of exposure has occurred.
The criterion for an exposure to a human being for bat rabies is a bite by the bat, a scratch by the bat, direct skin contact with the bat, or a bat in a room with a sleeping person or a person who's too young or incompetent in some other way to testify clearly whether they had contact with the bat while they were asleep.
It's very critical that the area of the skin that had the contact be washed immediately with soap and water. The second important thing, of course, is to keep the bat, to have it tested, to find out whether it's rabid, because hopefully it won't be rabies and then there won't be any need for rabies treatment. And then thirdly, a physician and a local health department needs to be contacted to discuss the issue about whether an exposure occurred and whether the bat needs to be tested.
Whenever bats are frequently encountered inside of a building, and particularly when there be multiple people present at the time, the investigation and management of possible exposures can be very difficult and very expensive. So in settings such as prisons and schools and hospitals and summer camps where there are likely to be frequent encounters with multiple people with bats, excluding bats from those buildings is particularly important. The first thing to remember when someone finds a bat inside their home or camp, particularly flying around in a human-occupied area, is to avoid direct contact with the bat, not to touch it with their bare hands. Keep children and pets away until the situation is controlled. Ideally, try to confine the bat to one room by closing doors and windows, and allow the bat to land and then capture the bat and retain it until it can be clearly investigated whether there's any potential direct human or pet contact with the bat, and it can be discussed with a local health authority to decide whether the bat is a candidate to be released or whether it will need to be tested.
People worry about getting rabies when they go into an attic that has a lot of bat guano or even a lot of bats in it, and you cannot get rabies through the air by air transmission of the virus by being close to a bat or in an area with a lot of bats or a lot of guano. They worry that there may be saliva that has rabies virus in it that gets onto a wall or some surface that a bat has had contact with, and that really has not been demonstrated to be any kind of risk factor. The virus is very fragile in the environment. It can be easily cleaned up, so there are no cases that have been linked to any kind of indirect contact with saliva on surfaces from bats. There are a number of risks and problems associated with rabies treatments. First of all, rabies treatments are extraordinarily expensive, and fortunately most people can have it covered by their state health department or by their insurance, but it still is very expensive, and certain parts of the rabies treatment, such as the immune globulin, can be in short supply. Another issue is that rabies treatment can be painful. It's certainly not as bad as it used to be, but with the modern biologics, the side effects and the pain associated with it are reduced, but there can be side effects. So for all of these reasons, the costs, the difficulties of getting the treatment, it requires at least 5 office visits spread over the period of a month. The common mild side effects or reactions and the chance of more serious reactions is why we recommend getting rabies treatment only when someone really needs it.
It's important to protect pets and other domestic animals from rabies, including bat rabies, since they serve as a bridge of transmission between wildlife and bats and ourselves, the people who care for them. There's several vaccines available for a number of our domestic species. That includes dogs, cats, ferrets, horses, cows, and sheep. These animals can be vaccinated